to you about the potential for phytotoxicity with some applications that might be earlier than what you normally may be considering. And so in particular, back in 2007, 2008, when we first started to use foliar fungicides on corn more commonly, people noticed and talked a lot about the development of what is called arrested ears, or like in that photo you see in the upper right hand corner, also called beer can ears, blunt ear syndrome. We heard a lot about that in a short amount of time. Well, initially, since the only thing that had really changed was the new use of foliar fungicides, people initially blamed the fungicides for the cause of those symptoms. When in reality, after some more research was done, it turns out that the blame probably should have been placed on the surfactants, and especially the use of those surfactants at particular crop stages. And so in particular, I'm going to emphasize vulnerable crop stage at around the V12 to V14 time period. That crop stage is particularly vulnerable because that is the time period when ear length is determined. And so some people might say even from V10 to V14 or so, any time immediately before tasseling, you're at increased risk for some damage. After observing those symptoms in Illinois in particular, they did make the observation that it seemed to be most common, or they identified it at least first, in fields that were sprayed with ground rigs, and especially sprayed before tasseling. So they kind of had an idea what might be going on, still blaming the fungicides at that time. And so we have the percent, that's an incidence of arrested ears in these treated plots. And then with the use of fungicides, insecticides, and then crop oil, insecticides plus crop oil, the NIS, and then glyphosate plus AMS, NIS plus glyphosate, different combinations there. These applications were all made around that same time period that I told you about earlier. And looking at this data set, you can see the fungicides were not to blame for the arrested ear development. It had an increase in incidence with the addition of more of these products, in particular crop oil, NIS, and especially the AMS glyphosate combination and glyphosate NIS combination on the end down there. A second study, also in 2008, was conducted at the University of Illinois by my counterparts over there, and also Emerson Knopfziger, agronomist. And different ear symptoms, but still phytotoxic effects nonetheless. Not the same beer can symptoms, but some other deleterious effects. And in the table, you can see percent of ears damaged, so that's another incidence rating for non-treated. Headline alone, NIS at 0.25%, NIS at 0.5%, and then headline plus NIS at 0.25% plus headline plus NIS at 0.5%. Coron is a nitrogen, a foliar feed, and so you can see it greatly increased the incidence of these damaged ears with the addition of NIS, the non-ionic surfactant, which is actually much more common with the use of ground rigs and ground applications. Crop oil would be more common in foliar applications made by plane because of the lower volumes, trying to prevent evaporation before the products are absorbed. And so the highest incidence down here when they really bumped up the rate of the NIS to 0.5%. Normally when I'm talking about fungicides, I'll be talking about fungicide applications that are normally made around tasseling or shortly thereafter. That's the most common timing, at least here in Nebraska. And so most of our results, like what we've got from 2010 here and 2009 there, are from that time period. And if forced to choose when I think the most effective time period would be, it would be in that window, because that's when we've got our most consistent results and economic returns with fungicides, regardless of the products that were chosen. Now, more recently, people have been much more interested in earlier fungicide applications like the V4 to V6, different times in that range. We've had less consistent results with timings that were early like that. And so we have done some work with that in different years and using different treatments. And so we've got both Stratego yield and headline here. Now, although these are not statistically different in spite of the large yield differences between the treatments, so there must have been some inconsistencies there and variability. highest yields, regardless of statistical variability, was at the R1 applications of either product. And so, looking at data from across our Midwest university counterparts, likewise, the most consistent results were with VT to R1 applications.
Why do we have growth stage restrictions on some of the products, or a lot of the products we use? First one is to not exceed any allowable pesticide residues in or on the plant, taking it to sale or to wherever the end use is. The second is to avoid crop injury, and that's what we're going to look at in these plots out here. And the third thing is to guarantee good weed control. If we're making applications that are beyond label, more than likely our weeds are very large out there. So that's one aspect. And if you think of the other aspect out there, if you're making an application to B8, B10 corn, what does that corn plant look like, and what does the field look like? It's pretty close to canopy out there, and you know, a lot of times I think that corn canopy is intercepting a lot of the herbicide that we may be trying to apply. Glyphosate is kind of almost ubiquitous in corn and soybean production in many aspects. So I think it's really important to kind of go back over these for a couple reasons. I'll get to that down here in a second. The first thing is not all glyphosate labels are the same. There's lots of generics out there. If you really go through and read some of those labels, the crop heights and stuff like that can vary from product to product. So you really have to kind of know the product that you're using. On the initial first Roundup Ready corn event, these next 4 points come off the Power Max label. Drop nozzles are recommended when the corn is beyond 24 inches tall. No applications beyond 30-inch tall corn with the first Roundup Ready event. You get to Roundup Ready 2 event, drop nozzles are required when corn is above 30 inches or about the V8 growth stage, and no applications beyond 48 inches. The other thing to think about is the maximum in-crop or in-season post-emergence use. And I'm coming at this from the glyphosate-resistant weed side of things, is how I'd like to frame it. Maximum in-crop applications, total less than 64 fluid ounces of the potassium salt or your Power Max or your Weather Max, 96 fluid ounces of IPA salt, which is a lot of the generics out there. A quick review on the soybean side. Label says emergence through flowering, R2 stage. Maximum weed height of 8 inches. This comes from the Power Max label. Any single application of the maximum amount in any single application is 44 ounces. Total in-season use of 64 ounces. So if we're in a situation where we do need to make a late application, you know, you saw on there the glyphosate label is going to say use drop nozzles if you're beyond this certain point. And one thing about that, when this picture here has tasseling corn, the other one is not tasseling, and I'll show you here in a second. And it's good to keep product out of the world, obviously, so you don't get a heavy dose right down in the world near the growing point. But things to think about with this, and we've seen this. I'll show you a couple pictures here in a few minutes. Think about the type of herbicide we're using: translocated, glyphosate, and the HPPD products that we might be using post. Where do they go in the plant? To the sink. At a time like this, you're talking about the ear and the tassel. That's where the majority of the growth and resources are going in the plant. A contact herbicide is mostly going to stay where it contacts the plant. The other thing is nozzle spacing on your sprayer. If your sprayer's on 15s or 30s, no problem. If you have 30-inch corn rows out there, you're going to be, if you're on 15s, you can cap off every other one, and you're going to be in the center doing the best job you can possibly do. If your sprayer is set up on 20s, it can be a little more challenging because every now and then, just depending on how the spacing is, it's entirely possible to have two drops going down a row. What is that going to do to pesticide concentration in this part of the canopy? There's a potential there to get an excessive dose. What we have is percent abnormal ears caused by a late application, and I believe this was it was like the V12 to V14 range, somewhere in there. And what's considered an abnormal ear is one of these ears where you get the jumbled row appearance on there. And this is percent abnormal ears compared to the untreated control, right down here. And we have different treatments. Glyphosate alone, glyphosate plus AMS, glyphosate plus 2,4-D, 2,4-D alone, NIS alone, crop oil, AMS, and then the control over here. And you can see in this one example, keep this number in mind when we go out to the plots out here. They had they actually got some kind of response on those ears, on almost all the ears. This is just percent kernel number, so total amount of kernels produced in that plot as affected by late application. And again, we're comparing to our control or no late application treatment here. Glyphosate alone lost about 9% of the kernels. Glyphosate plus AMS, the one that had the highest level of abnormal ears, 77% compared to 100. Glyphosate 2,4-D was 82. 2,4-D did not have much of an impact on kernel number. The NIS alone, there was a pretty severe reduction right there. Crop oil and then AMS were to a lesser degree. When do newly emerging weeds no longer reduce corn yield? A classic extension answer right here, well, it depends, right? Say in a corn crop, are sunflowers or foxtails more competitive coming up late? Probably the sunflowers in there. Density has an issue to play. Are you high or low densities? Good soil fertility? Do we have adequate moisture? All those things can come into play. But when Mark went through the literature on this, he found a range of growth stages where allowing weeds to come back in didn't have any effect, any statistical effect on yield reduction. One of the more extreme examples was V2. On the other end, allowing weeds to, there was one study found that allowing weeds to come back in at the R1 silking stage actually produced some yield loss attributable to weeds. But on average across there, it was about V10.